Meriwether Lewis was an American explorer, soldier, politician, and public administrator, best known for his role as the leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition, also known as the Corps of Discovery, with William Clark. The mission was to explore the territory of the Louisiana Purchase, establish trade with and sovereignty over the natives near the Missouri River, and claim the Pacific Northwest and Oregon country for the United States before European nations. They also collected scientific data and information on indigenous nations. President Thomas Jefferson appointed him Governor of Upper Louisiana in 1806. He died of gunshot wounds in what was either a murder or suicide. In 1809. Life and work. Meriwether Lewis was born in Albemarle County, Virginia, in the present-day community of Ivy. He was the son of Lt. William Lewis of Locust Hill, who was of Welsh ancestry, and Lucy Meriwether, daughter of Thomas Meriwether and Elizabeth Thornton, who were both of English ancestry. After his father died of pneumonia, he moved with his mother and stepfather Captain John Marks to Georgia in May 1780. They settled along the Broad River in the Goose Pond community, within the Broad River Valley in Wilkes County. Louis had no formal education until he was 13 years of age, but during his time in Georgia he enhanced his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman. He would often venture out in the middle of the night in the dead of winter with only his dog to go hunting. Even at an early age, he was interested in natural history, which would develop into a lifelong passion. His mother taught him how to gather wild herbs for medicinal purposes. In the Broad River Valley, Lewis first dealt with American Indians. This was the traditional territory of the Cherokee, who resented encroachment by the colonists. Louis seems to have been a champion for them among his own people. While in Georgia, he met Eric Parker, who encouraged him to travel. At 13, Louis was sent back to Virginia for education by private tutors. His father's older brother Nicholas Lewis became his guardian. One of his tutors was Parson Matthew Maury, an uncle of Matthew Fontaine Maury. In 1793, Lewis graduated from Liberty Hall. That year he joined the Virginia militia, and in 1794 he was sent as part of a detachment involved in putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1795 Lewis joined the U.S. Army, commissioned as an ensign. By 1800 he rose to captain, and ended his service there in 1801. Among his commanding officers was William Clark, who would later become his companion in the Corps of Discovery. On April 1, 1801, Lewis was appointed as an aide by President Thomas Jefferson, whom he knew through Virginia Society in Albemarle County. Louis resided in the presidential mansion, and frequently conversed with various prominent figures in politics, the arts and other circles. He compiled information on the personnel and politics of the United States Army, which had seen an influx of Federalist officers as a result of midnight appointments made by outgoing President John Adams in 1801. When Jefferson began to plan for an expedition across the continent, he chose Lewis to lead the expedition. Meriwether Lewis recruited Clark, then aged 33, to share command of the expedition. The expedition after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Jefferson wanted to get an accurate sense of the new land and its resources. The president also hoped to find a direct and practicable water communication across this continent, for the purposes of commerce with Asia. Quote, in addition, Jefferson placed special importance on declaring U.S. sovereignty over the Native Americans along the Missouri River. The 2-year exploration by Lewis and Clark was the first transcontinental expedition to the Pacific coast by the United States. However, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific 12 years after Sir Alexander Mackenzie had done so overland in Canada. When they left Fort Mandan in April 1805, they were accompanied by the 16-year-old Shoshone Indian woman Sacagawea, the wife of the French-Canadian fur trader Toussaint Charbonneau. The Corps of Discovery made contact with many Native Americans in the Trans-Mississippi West and found them accustomed to dealing with European traders and already connected to global markets. After crossing the Rocky Mountains, the expedition reached the Oregon Country and the Pacific Ocean in November 1805. They returned in 1806, bringing with them an immense amount of information about the region as well as numerous plant and animal specimens. They demonstrated the possibility of overland travel to the Pacific coast. The success of their journey helped to strengthen the American concept of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to reach all the way across North America from Atlantic to Pacific. Return and gubernatorial duties. After returning from the expedition, Louis received a reward of 1,600 acres of land. He also initially made arrangements to publish the Corps of Discovery journals, but had difficulty completing his writing. In 1807, Jefferson appointed him governor of the Louisiana Territory. He settled in St. Louis. Lewis's record as an administrator is mixed. He published the first laws in the Upper Louisiana Territory, established roads and furthered Jefferson's mission as a strong proponent of the fur trade. He negotiated peace among several quarreling Indian tribes. His duty to enforce Indian treaties was to protect the western Indian lands from encroachment, which was opposed by the rush of settlers looking to open new lands for settlements. But due to his quarreling with local political leaders, controversy over his approvals of trading licenses, land grant politics, and Indian depredations, some historians have argued that Louis was a poor administrator. That view has been reconsidered in recent biographies. Louis's primary quarrels were with his territorial secretary Frederick Bates. Bates was accused of undermining Louis to seek Louis's dismissal and his own appointment as governor. Because of the slow-moving mail system, former President Jefferson and Louis's superiors in Washington got the impression that Louis did not adequately keep in touch with them. Bates wrote letters to Louis's superiors accusing Louis of profiting from a mission to return a command-in-chief to his tribe. Because of Bates' accusation, the War Department refused to reimburse Louis for a large sum he personally advanced for the mission. When Louis's creditors heard that Louis would not be reimbursed for the expenses, they called Louis's notes, forcing him to liquidate his assets, including land he was granted for the Lewis and Clark expedition. One of the primary reasons Louis set out for Washington on this final trip was to clear up questions raised by Bates and to seek a reimbursement of the money he had advanced for the territorial government. The U.S. government finally reimbursed the expenses to Louis's estate 2 years after his death. Bates eventually became governor of Missouri, though some historians have speculated that Louis abused alcohol or opiates based upon an account attributed to Gilbert Russell at Fort Pickering on Louis's final journey. Others have argued that Bates never alleged that Louis suffered from such addictions and that Bates certainly would have used them against Louis if Louis suffered from those conditions. Freemasonry. Louis was a Freemason, initiated, passed and raised in the Order Virtue Lodge No. 44 inches in Albemarle, Virginia, between 1796 and 1797. On August 2, 1808, Louis and several of his acquaintances submitted a petition to the Head Lodge of Pennsylvania requesting dispensation to establish a lodge in St. Louis. Louis was nominated and recommended to serve as the first master of the proposed lodge, which was warranted as Lodge No. 111 on September 16, 1808. Lewis and slavery. Unlike William Clark, who brought his slave York on the westward expedition, Lewis did not have a personal valley slave, although Lewis attempted to supervise enslaved people while running his mother's plantation before the expedition. He left that post and had no valet during the expedition. Lewis made assignments to York but allowed Clark to supervise him. Lewis also granted York and Sacagawea votes during expedition meetings. Later, Lewis hired a free African-American man as his valet, John Purnier. Purnier accompanied Lewis during his final journey, although his wages were considerably in arrears. After Lewis's death, Purnier continued to Monticello and asked Jefferson to pay the $240 owed him, but was refused. Purnier later committed suicide. Death. On September 3, 1809, Lewis set out for Washington, D.C., where he hoped to resolve issues regarding the denied payment of drafts he had drawn against the War Department while serving as governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, leaving him in potentially ruinous debt. Lewis carried his journals with him for delivery to his publisher. He intended to travel to Washington by ship from New Orleans, but changed his plans while floating down the Mississippi River from St. Louis. He disembarked and decided instead to make an overland journey via the Natchez Trace and then east to Washington. Robbers preyed on travelers on that road and sometimes killed the victims. Lewis had written his will before his journey and also attempted suicide on this journey, but was restrained. Circumstances. According to a lost October 18, 1809 letter to Thomas Jefferson, Lewis stopped at an inn on the Natchez Trace called Grinder's Stand, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville on October 10, 1809. After dinner, he retired to his one-room cabin. In the pre-dawn hours of October 11, the innkeeper's wife heard gunshots. Servants found Lewis badly injured from multiple gunshot wounds, one each to the head and gut. He bled out on his buffalo hide robe and died shortly after sunrise. The Nashville Democratic-Clarion published the account, which newspapers across the country repeated and embellished. The Nashville newspaper also reported that Lewis's throat was cut. Money that Lewis had borrowed from Major Gilbert Russell at Fort Pickering to complete their journey was missing. While Lewis's friend Thomas Jefferson and some modern historians have generally accepted Lewis's death as a suicide, debate continues. As discussed below, no one reported seeing Lewis shoot himself. 3 inconsistent, somewhat contemporary accounts are attributed to Mrs. Griner, who left no written account or testimony, some thus believe her testimony was fabricated, while others point to it as proof of suicide. Mrs. Griner claimed Lewis acted strangely the night before his death, standing and pacing during dinner and talking to himself in the way one would speak to a lawyer, with face flushed as if it had come on him in a fit. She continued to hear him talking to himself after he retired, and then at some point in the night, she heard multiple gunshots, a scuffle, and someone calling for help. She claimed to be able to see Lewis through the slit in the door crawling back to his room. However, she never explained why she never investigated further at the time, but only the next morning sent her children to look for Lewis's servants. Another account claimed the servants found Lewis in the cabin, wounded and bloody, with part of his skull gone, but he lived for several hours. In the last account attributed to Mrs. Griner, 3 men followed Lewis up the Natchez Trace, and he pulled his pistols and challenged them to a duel. In that account, Mrs. Griner said that she heard voices and gunfire in Lewis's cabin about 1 a.m. She found the cabin empty and a large amount of gunpowder on the floor. Thus, in this account, Lewis's body was found outside the cabin. Lewis's mother and relatives always contended it was murder. A coroner's jury held an inquest immediately after Lewis's death as provided by local law. However, they did not charge anyone with murdering Lewis. The jury foreman kept a pocket diary of the proceedings, which disappeared in the early 1900s. When William Clark and Thomas Jefferson were informed of Lewis's death, both accepted the conclusion of suicide, based on the positions and the never-found Lewis letter of mid-September 1809. Historian Stephen Ambrose dismisses the murder theory as not convincing. Later analyses, the only doctor to examine Lewis's body, did not do so until 40 years later, in 1848. The Tennessee State Commission, including Dr. Samuel B. Moore, charged with locating Lewis's grave and erecting a monument over it, opened Lewis's grave. The commission wrote in its official report that though the impression had long prevailed that Lewis died by his own hand, it seems to be more probable that he died by the hands of an assassin. In the book The History of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, first printed in 1893, the editor Elliott Coues expressed doubt about Thomas Jefferson's conclusion that Lewis committed suicide, despite including the former president's memoir of Meriwether Lewis in his book. From 1993 to 2010, about 200 of Lewis's kin sought to have the body exhumed for forensic analysis, to try to determine whether the death was a suicide. A Tennessee coroner's jury in 1996 recommended exhumation. However, since Lewis's gravesite is in a national monument, the National Park Service must approve. The agency refused the request in 1998, citing possible disturbance to the bodies of more than 100 pioneers buried nearby. In 2008, the Department of the Interior approved the exhumation, but rescinded that decision in 2010 after the change in administrations, stating that decision is final. It is nonetheless improving the gravesite and visit facility. Historian Paul Russell Cartwright wrote a detailed refutation of the murder-robbery theory, concluding that it lacks legs to stand on. He stressed Lewis's debts, heavy drinking, and possible morphine-opium use, failure to prepare the expedition's journals for publication, repeated failure to find a wife, and a deterioration of his friendship with Thomas Jefferson. This refutation was countered by Eldon G. Chouinard, who argued for the murder hypothesis. Leading Lewis scholars Donald Jackson, J. H. Buckley, Clay S. Jenkinson and others have stated that, regardless of the leanings or beliefs, that the facts of his death are not known, there are no eyewitnesses, and that the reliability of reports of those in the place of vicinity cannot be considered certain. Author Peter Stark believes that post-traumatic stress disorder may have been a contributor to Meriwether Lewis's condition after spending months traversing hostile Indian territory, particularly because travelers coming afterward exhibited the same symptoms. Memorials. The explorer was buried near present-day Hernval, Tennessee, near his place of death. His grave was located about 200 yards from Grinder's Stand, alongside the Natchez Trace. At first the grave was unmarked. Alexander Wilson, an ornithologist and friend of Lewis's who visited the grave in May 1810, during a trip to New Orleans to sell his drawings, wrote that he gave the innkeeper Robert Griner money to erect a fence around the grave to protect it from animals. The state of Tennessee erected a monument over Lewis's grave in 1848. Lemuel Kirby, a stonemason from Columbia, Tennessee, chose the design of a broken column, commonly used at the time to symbolize a life cut short. An iron fence erected around the base of the monument was partially dismantled during the Civil War by General Hood's detachments marching from Shiloh toward Franklin, they forged the iron into horseshoes. A September 1905 article in Everybody's Magazine called attention to Lewis's abandoned and overgrown grave. A county road worker, Teen Cothran, took the initiative to open a road to the cemetery. Thereafter, a local Tennessee Meriwether Lewis Monument Committee was soon formed to push for restoring Lewis's gravesite. In 1925, in response to the committee's work, President Calvin Coolidge designated Lewis's grave as the fifth national monument in the South. The state highway providing access to the site was designated by the state of Tennessee as the Lewis and Clark Memorial Highway, extending from the Lewis Monument to Dyersburg, Tennessee to Ward Street. Louis, today, a small section of the State Highway 20 outside the park, is still officially designated as the Meriwether Lewis Memorial Highway. The War Department was given authority to maintain the site. War Department personnel added 4 feet of dirt over graves surrounding Lewis's monument to create the appearance of a military cemetery. 3 War Department interpretive tablets were placed at the site to tell the story of Lewis's death. Stone gates bearing bronze markers engraved Meriwether Lewis National Monument were erected at the entrance to the site on the old Natchez Trace. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration and CCC workers camped at the site built a cabin museum a few feet southwest of the Grinders Stand site. While their original objective was to duplicate the design of Grinders Stand, no reliable description could be located. The War Department turned control of the site over to the National Park Service. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed legislation incorporating the Meriwether Lewis National Monument into the Natchez Trace Parkway and authorizing the Secretary of the Interior to give the monument the appropriate official designation. However, the Secretary of the Interior has never acted to change the designation, and Meriwether Lewis National Monument still appears on some official maps, though the stone entrance gates have been dismantled and the bronze markers have been placed in storage. Today, the gravesite is maintained by the Natchez Trace Parkway, a unit of the National Park Service. In 2009, the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation organized a commemoration for Lewis in conjunction with the 41st annual meeting October 3–7, 2009. It included the first national memorial service at his gravesite, on October 7, 2009, near the 200th anniversary of Lewis's death. About 2,500 people from more than 25 states gathered at his grave to acknowledge Lewis's life and achievements. Speakers included William Clark's descendant Peyton Bud Clark, Lewis's collateral descendants Howell Bowen and Tom McSwain, and Stephanie Ambrose Tubbs. A bronze bust of Lewis was dedicated at the Natchez Trace Parkway for a planned visit center at the gravesite area. The District of Columbia and governors of 20 states associated with the Lewis and Clark Trail sent flags flown over state capitol buildings to be carried to Lewis's grave by residents of the states, acknowledging the significance of Lewis's contribution in the creation of the states. The 2009 ceremony at Lewis's grave was the final bicentennial event honoring the Lewis and Clark expedition. Reenactors from the Lewis and Clark bicentennial participated, and official attendees included representatives from Jefferson's Monticello, Lewis and Clark descendants and family members, along with representatives of St. Louis Lodge No. 1, past presidents of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, carried wreaths and led a formal procession to Lewis's grave. Samples of plants which Lewis discovered on the expedition were brought from the trail states and laid on his grave. The U.S. Army was represented by the 101st Airborne Infantry Band and its Army chaplain. The National Park Service announced that it would rehabilitate the site. The cabin has since been restored, and new exhibits have been added inside the cabin and on trails leading to the cabin. Legacy. For many years, Lewis's legacy was overlooked, inaccurately assessed, and somewhat tarnished by his alleged suicide. Yet his contributions to science, the exploration of the western U.S., and the lore of great world explorers are considered incalculable. 4 years after Lewis's death, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Of courage undaunted, possessing a firmness and perseverance of purpose which nothing but impossibilities could divert from its direction, honest, disinterested, liberal, of sound understanding and a fidelity to truth so scrupulous that whatever he should report would be as certain as if seen by ourselves, with all these qualifications as if selected and implanted by nature in one body for this express purpose. I could have no hesitation in confiding the enterprise to him." Jefferson wrote that Lewis had a luminous and discriminating intellect. William Clark's first son, Meriwether Lewis Clark, was named after Lewis. The senior Meriwether Clark passed the name on to his son, Meriwether Lewis Clark, Jr. Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark commanded the Corps of Discovery to map the course of the Missouri River to its source and the Pacific Northwest overland and water routes to and from the mouth of the Columbia River. They were honored with a 3-cent stamp July 24, 1954, on the 150th anniversary. The 1803 Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. Lewis and Clark described and sketched its flora and fauna and described the native inhabitants they encountered before returning to St. Louis in 1806. Coins. Both Lewis and Clark appear on the gold Lewis and Clark Exposition dollars minted for the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. Among the early United States commemorative coins, they were produced in both 1904 and 1905 and survive in relatively small numbers. Postage stamps. The Lewis and Clark expedition was celebrated on May 14, 2004, the 200th anniversary of its outset, by depicting the two on a hilltop outlook. 2 companion 37-cent USPS stamps showed portraits of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. A special 32-page booklet accompanied the issue in 11 cities along the route taken by the Corps of Discovery. An image of the stamp can be found on Arago online at the link in the footnote. Flora and fauna. The plant genus Lewissia, popular in rock gardens and which includes the bitterroot, the state flower of Montana, is named after Lewis, as is Lewis's woodpecker and a subspecies of cutthroat trout, the Westlope cutthroat. Geographic names. Geographic names that honor him include Lewis County, Idaho; Lewis County, Kentucky; Lewis County, Tennessee; Lewisburg, Tennessee; Lewiston, Idaho; Lewis County, Washington; the U.S. Army Fort Lewis, Washington, the home of the U.S. Army First Corps; Lewis and Clark County, Montana, the home of the capital city, Helena; Lewis and Clark Pass, Lewistown, Montana, the Lewis Range of Montana's Glacier National Park; Louis Avenue in Phoenix, Arizona; Louis Avenue in Billings, Montana; Gates of the Mountains Wilderness, a day-use campground north of Helena, Montana's Meriwether picnic site; Lewis and Clark Caverns, a cave between Three Forks and Whitehall, Montana. Vessels. 3 U.S. Navy vessels have been named in honor of Lewis: the Liberty ship SS Meriwether Lewis, the Polaris armed nuclear submarine USS Lewis and Clark, and the supply ship USNS Lewis and Clark. Academic institutions. Lewis and Clark College, Portland, Oregon, was named for Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis Clark State College, Lewiston, Idaho, was named for Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Popular culture. Meriwether Lewis's relationship with Thomas Jefferson, Lewis's multiple expeditions, journals, and discoveries, and details surrounding Lewis's death play major roles in James Rollins's Seventh Sigma Force novel, The Devil Colony. Ancestry.